Given what's going on in the world, we take a look at the book of Esther today. This takes place in Persia, and actually in the section of Persia that at that point would have been known as Elam, in the city of Susa. And it's really southwest Iran, southwest Persia, just on the banks of the Persian Gulf. Take a look at what we see right here at the very beginning. So, just this is what happened during the time of Xerxes. Now, this is Xerxes I, and that he was also known as Artaxerxes or Ahasuerus, different ways of pronouncing that. The area that he ruled was massive, much, much bigger than modern day Iran. And to distinguish him from the other Xerxes, this is the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush. Now, Kush is Egypt, but Kush actually went into some of Libya. So it's massive. And then, if you were to look at a map of the empire, um, it went up into just the western portion of Greece, all of Turkey, all throughout that whole eastern half of the Mediterranean, and then to India, and then down into North Africa and into Egypt. It was massive. Um, and at that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, which is in Elam, southwest portion of Persia. And in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. Now, third year would have been his reign started uh, around 465 BC. So this is about 462 BC. So almost 5 centuries before Jesus. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes, and the nobles of the provinces were present. So he pretty much gathered everybody there from the 127 satraps, which are really just provinces. Okay, so uh, this is NIV, and so it says provinces. The King James would say satraps. For a full 180 days, so now you've got basically, half a year. He displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. Okay, so he's just really, showing everyone how incredible this kingdom was. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet that lasted 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. Okay, so big party. Um, and in that party, he had Queen Vashti, and she also gave a banquet for the women, and that was in the palace itself, which was there in the citadel of Susa. And then on the seventh day, so here in yellow, when King Xerxes, so the last day, was in high spirits, basically he was drunk from wine, he commanded the seven eunuchs who served him, Mahuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass. Okay, so that's a challenge to say all their names. And they were eunuchs, they were trusted because the presumption was they would not be lusting after the women, and that they would be more servile. To bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at, apparently a beautiful woman. Um, but then she refused. And so the king then became furious and he burned with anger. So he's really upset with Vashti. And now he's got to deal with this because this was very public. And so um, the discussion amongst his nobles and his advisors, his viziers, if you will, was this. Okay, here in yellow, Queen Vashti has done wrong. not only against the king, but also against the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. So basically, I'm not coming before you either. So they were concerned about this rebellion amongst the women. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There'll be no end of disrespect and discord. Okay, so this now has become a national catastrophe. They're concerned their whole culture is going to start to unravel. And it was a culture in which the women were essentially slaves. Um, and it doesn't speak about polygamy here, but polygamy was the norm, not the exception. And they had harems and so on. Um, and so the ultimate edict was that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes, never. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she, and that's going to be Esther. And then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. Okay, so that's the background. The king was happy with this. The nobles were happy with this. They decided this is what they were going to do. So now, after King Xerxes settles down, um, and he started thinking about this, and he says, and his personal attendants, his viziers, said, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young women, let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." So then they're picking a new queen. So they go through all of that. And there was a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, that's Mordecai. And Mordecai is the uncle of a young woman who is called Hadassah, and her Jewish name, but was also known as Esther, which is how we know her. And it just says she had a lovely figure and was beautiful. And Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So she was an orphan. Mordecai raised her. And this beauty pageant goes by the king, and the king is attracted to Esther here in the green more than any of the other women. She won his favor, approved more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And then the king gave another great banquet. He obviously gave a lot of great banquets. And this was Esther's banquet for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. So this was an exciting thing for everybody. The royal palace now had a queen again. Now, Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate. Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to, for she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. Okay, and Esther, in all likelihood, at this point, is probably in her early 20s, so relatively young woman. And so there is a plot to kill the king. And there are these two guys, Bigthana and Teresh, who are two of the king's officers who have this plot. They guarded the doorway, and Mordecai finds out about it. And he tells Queen Esther And Esther, in turn, reports it to the king, and she gives the credit to Mordecai. And when the report is investigated and they find out it's true, then these two men are impaled on poles. And then this gets recorded in the annals of the Persians and the Medes. Okay, so that kind of sets the stage for the background. So Mordecai has done something great for the king, but it turns out nothing happens. He's not rewarded in any way, but he has saved the king's life. Well, after all of this, okay, Xerxes honors Haman. Okay, and Haman is elevated and he's given a seat of honor higher than all of the other nobles. So basically, he's the number two guy in the kingdom. And everyone is supposed to kneel down when he comes past. They're supposed to be respectful to him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. All right, so the plot begins to thicken. And so Mordecai is asked, why do you disobey the king's command? Day after day, they spoke to him, asked him this, and he continued to refuse to comply. So they told Haman. And Haman now is quite upset. And so here in red, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai, which is what he was going to do initially. And instead, he decided he was going to kill all the Jews. All right, so the background here is the Jews, okay, and remember the size of the kingdom. The Jews basically, probably almost all the Jews in the world, maybe all the Jews in the world, were going to be put to death because of Haman and Mordecai. And so now in the 12th year of Xerxes, in the first month, that's the month of Nisan, the Pur, that's translated as, that's the word that gets translated as Lot. So Purim, they add im for their plural. So we add an s, they added im. So Purim means lots. This is the month of lots. And it was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and a month. And this was the time when they would all be put to death. So they're trying to decide what is the day, and they cast lots to determine the day that Mordecai and all the Jews are going to be put to death. Okay, and so now Haman speaks to Xerxes, and he says this, King, there's a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate, which the Jews did. Their customs are different from those of all other people. They don't obey the king's laws. It's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury. In other words, he's offering a bribe to do this. Well, the king takes his signet ring off of his finger. He gives it to Haman, and he says, keep the money and do with the people as you please. In other words, I don't care about the money. He's so ridiculously wealthy. That's not going to add to his fortune. But it's an attempted bribe anyway. And so he gives Haman the approval. And so now here in green, the couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadels of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered, a real understatement. Okay, the fact that this is going to happen, the Jews are going to be killed, what's going on? Well, Mordecai hears about it. He tears his clothes, he puts on sackcloth and ashes, he mourns, he fasts, he prays, and he goes out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. He goes to the king's gate. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and they told her about Mordecai, she was now in great distress, as you might imagine. What is going on with Mordecai? Okay, and so then Esther summons Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her. She had multiple, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. And of course, she finds out. And it's reported back to Esther that the Jews are going to be killed, and Haman is going to do it. So she instructed Hathach to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless he extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So basically, she understands that she is in a position where she could go to the king, but it's been 30 days since the king has seen her. So she would have to go and take the chance that the king would have her put to death, because you weren't permitted to go into the king's presence unless you were requested by the king. And, now it was clearly high risk for her to go to the king and try to intervene and intercede on behalf of Mordecai and the Jews. And so that what Esther had said got back to Mordecai, and Mordecai says, don't think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. So, words you may have heard before. There's a book written by that, for such a time as this, speaking about Esther. And it's interesting, too, because he says in here, look, if you don't do what is clearly the right thing to do because you're afraid of dying, God will raise somebody else up to do it. Okay, now, as we know, Esther actually follows through, but notice what she says. And this is really, I think it's very powerful, one of the most powerful things you find in the Old Testament. Esther sends a reply to Mordecai, and she says, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And then she says, and if I perish, I perish. So she makes the decision. If I die, I die. That's it. I will do it. I'm not afraid of dying. The cause is just. The cause is correct. And she's willing to bet her life on this. And whatever happens, she'll accept. Okay, but notice that she says fast for 3 days. Now, everybody has difficult times in their lives where there's something they desperately need and they don't have. That is the norm. We go through life and there are these situations that arise from time to time. And it could be health for ourselves or for somebody else. It could be financial. It could be any number of different things. It could be some major change in your life. It should be something that could relate to a job. It could any particular area. Well, what you see is this pattern throughout Scripture. You see it with Nehemiah. Nehemiah desperately wants to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls. When he hears the horrible situation Jerusalem is in after the captivity has pretty much ended, and Jews had gone back to Israel, but Jerusalem was a mess. The walls were down, and it was not a good situation. And he desperately wanted to go and rebuild the walls. And he went before Artaxerxes and he requests to do that. Now, that was some years later. That's in 445 BC. This is all happening in the early 460s. So 15 years earlier, 16 years earlier, and Nehemiah fasts and prays before he goes before the king to make that request. And you may recall it speaks there in Nehemiah about this same law that they had, that if he speaks in the king's presence without being spoken to, he can be put to death. And yet ultimately he does. He speaks. The king sees that he looks sad and speaks to him, and Nehemiah speaks, and he is sent back to Jerusalem, not merely on his own, but basically part of the army goes with him, and they send supplies for rebuilding the wall. Same Artaxerxes. So it's a very interesting thing, and that by the way is a key time, because what you read in Daniel chapter 9 is from the going forth of a decree to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And then it says it'll be 69 weeks of years, 483 years. Well, when that gets calculated out, and I did that calculation, as some of you know, before coming to the Lord, it turns out that it prophesies that from the going forth of that decree until the Messiah is cut off, until the Messiah is put to death, will be 69 weeks of years, 483 years. And you do the calculation, it comes out to 30 AD, which is the point at which most theologians would think that Jesus was put to death. And I would say fairly definitely, I believe that that's when he was put to death and then ultimately raised from the dead. Okay, but this matter of fasting is key. And if you can, I would recommend it to you when you're facing the big trials of life. I don't know all the specifics of how God views this in detail, but I do know at a high level, it seems to make a significant difference. Jesus, on a spiritual plane, Jesus, when the disciples come to him and they're unable to cast out some demons, he says these only come out with fasting and prayer. Somehow the fasting is like an amplifier for our prayers. Maybe it just means, Lord, I'm really serious about this. Serious enough that I'll deny myself. Now, some people can't fast, and so that's, so I don't do anything, obviously, to threaten your health, but it turns out that fasting itself is generally quite beneficial. Intermittent fasting, for example, is about the only way that you can get rid of visceral fat, the fat that surrounds your organs in your belly. If you just lose weight, normally the visceral fat is largely untouched. It also introduces the kind of the garbage collection in your system, getting rid of ailing cells and dead cells and so on. It winds up having a variety of different health benefits, and does a sort of a reset from a physical standpoint. But in any event, Esther begs Mordecai, not for health reasons, but really before she goes into the king, that he and all the Jews, and then she and her attendants, will all fast, seeking God's intervention and God's favor before she goes before Xerxes and says, if I perish, I perish. And so on the third day, she puts on her royal robes and stands at the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance, when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court. He was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter. So when he did that, she knew that she was not going to be put to death. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request?" And then he says this, "Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." And so she asks, but she doesn't tell him just then what the request is. She begins and she says, "Let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." Bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we may do what Esther asks. And then Esther says, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Okay, so she's not telling him the full request. She's just saying, "Come tomorrow to the banquet, and then I'll tell you." Well, Haman, okay, and you see it here in yellow, was really happy, and says in high spirits, because he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, observed that he didn't rise or show him his presence. He was really upset with him, but he restrained himself. He went in, and he was going to be honored by the queen. Calling together his friends and Zeresh's wife, he said, Haman, told them, he said he boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons. He had 10 sons, and all the ways the king had honored him and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And he said, "That's not all. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king." It's me and the king. Boy, this is incredible. All this gives me no satisfaction, however, because of Mordecai. As long as I see that Jew, Mordecai, sitting at the king's gate. So his wife, Zeresh, and his friends say to him, and here highlighted in kind of a brownish color, "Have a pole set up reaching a height of 50 cubits, that's 75 feet, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself." And so it says Haman was delighted. And so he had the pole set up. Okay, so as you look at this, let's go on. So let me get the mouse back. Here we go. So the king couldn't sleep. And to help him sleep, he was going to read this big book, or have this big book read to him, the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign. He had it brought him and read to him. And there they read about Mordecai and how Mordecai had exposed these two assassins, or potential assassins, and that ultimately he had stopped the assassination attempt because of that. And now the king says, "Well, what honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" And they said, "Nothing's been done." Okay, and so the king then turns to his attendants there, and he says, "Hey, who's in the court right now?" And Haman had just come in, and so he says, "Bring in Haman." And when Haman entered, the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Haman, of course, thinks Haman is the king is talking about Haman. Haman is the one that's going to get honored. And so he answers the king, "For the man who delights to be honored, or who the king delights to honor, have them bring in a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" All along he's thinking, this is me. This is going to be great. I'm going to be riding the king's horse. I'm going to be wearing the king's robe. I'm going to have a noble leading the horse. And it's going to be fantastic. And so the king says, "Go at once. Get the robe," here highlighted in red. "Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. Well, Haman at this point gets the robe and the horse. He robes Mordecai, leads him on horseback through the city streets. So he's the guy leading him. And he has to proclaim before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Well, you can imagine Mordecai now is scared stiff. He's upset. He rushes home, his head covered in grief, and he tells his wife, all his friends, everything that's happened to him. And they say to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you can't stand against him. You'll surely come to ruin. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away in the banquet that Esther had prepared. So the king doesn't know about Haman yet. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, here highlighted in yellow, as they were drinking wine on the second day. So everybody is in high spirits. The king, a little drunk. The king again asks, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. And so here in green, she answers, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. Okay, you can imagine when she said that, he would have been shocked. What do you mean? My life? Are you going to die? And of course, she was. Haman had so maneuvered so that there was this edict that all the Jews were going to be killed. This is my petition. Spare my people, basically, and me. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet because no such distress could justify disturbing the king. And then Xerxes asked, who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing. And then she says, an adversary and enemy, Haman. Okay, and then Haman was terrified because he's there and she's pointing him out and he's right there. And then the king is in a rage. He leaves his wine, goes out into the palace garden. Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Okay, even a bigger mistake. And just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. And so you can imagine what the king thought. And he says, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? So then, as you read the rest of the story, what you see is that pole that's described as a pole reaching to the height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king, and the king says, impale Haman on it. So they impaled Haman on the pole that had been set up for Mordecai. And then the king's fury subsided. But there was still a problem. And the problem was the edict that had gone out to kill all the Jews was still in effect. First thing that Xerxes does is he gives Esther the estate of Haman. So all of Haman's wealth that Haman was bragging about is now Esther's. And then he hands his signet ring to Mordecai and Esther, and they make a law to basically counteract the edict, which enables the Jews to both protect themselves and gather in ways that otherwise they would not be permitted, and also then to kill those who would have killed the Jews. And so we read here in the green, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? And then there was another decree in the king's name, on behalf of the Jews, written, and the king says, as seems best to you, Esther. Um, we use and seal it with the king's signet ring so everybody knows this is from the king. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with this ring can be revoked. And so everything was reversed. The Jews in every city were granted the right to assemble, protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. Now, those days, by the way, correspond to March 2nd and 3rd of this year. That would have been the month of Adar, in the middle of the month of Adar. And a copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. When Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, interesting, the colors of Israel today, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. So everything happens differently. Now, notice that it had gotten to the eve of the Jews being destroyed. Everything was set. And notice also that no law of Xerxes could be overturned or canceled, so that the people could have reasonably thought, this is going to happen. There is absolutely nothing we can do to stop it. I don't know how many times you've faced situations like this in your life, but I think everyone to some degree encounters those situations where it seems like there is no way out. It is impossible. And yet, you can see the book of Esther shows, yes, with man, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. There was a way out. And this is the way out. And the Jews ultimately survive. And so what we read is Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. And then the Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. And in the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed Parshan and so on, the list of the 10 sons of Haman. And they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Okay, so very interesting. They didn't seek to take the treasures of others. All they wanted to do was protect themselves. And ultimately, they impaled the 10 sons of Haman also on poles, very similar to the way that Haman had been. And so what happened to Haman and his sons was exactly what had been planned to happen to Mordecai. And now Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, of course, this year, March 2nd and 3rd, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy, and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. And of course, we know that day, those days now as the Feast of Purim, the Feast of Lots. And so Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, prominent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews. because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. It's important to note that this situation described in Esther preserved the Jews. Had that not happened, what is happening right now in Iran would not be happening. So that everything comes full circle here. The Persians saved the Jews.